Okay, picture this. It's the year 1346, and a merchant ship is quietly docking on the shores of Sicily. On the surface, it's just another routine trade arrival, right? But hidden on board is a microscopic stowaway that is literally about to change the entire trajectory of human history. Within just a few years, the world would be utterly unrecognizable. Now, your history teacher probably taught you about the sheer devastation of the Black Death, the plague doctors, the unimaginable tragedy of it all, but what they likely left out is the absolute most fascinating part of the story. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into the actual data to see how this medieval catastrophe accidentally and permanently birthed the modern world.
75 million people. Just let that sink in for a second. In the span of just 7 short years, from 1346 to 1353, half of the entire European population was completely wiped out. I mean, it's a staggering, almost incomprehensible number to wrap your head around. This isn't just a massive data point. It's the brutal mathematical reality of an event that essentially forced a hard reset on human civilization.
Chapter 1. The Anatomy of Catastrophe.
The sheer speed of this plague was absolutely terrifying. It traveled from that first docking in Sicily all the way up to the freezing coastlines of Norway in just 5 years. That is 3,000 kilometers, over 1,800 miles. And remember, this is at a time in human history when the absolute fastest vehicle on planet Earth was a horse. So how on earth did a bacteria move so rapidly? Well, it turns out it followed the exact same Silk Road trade routes that previously carried immense wealth, silk, and spices. The very arteries of global commerce suddenly became the arteries of death.
And because it hitched a ride on trade, the plague wasn't just some random act of nature. It operated as what we might call a tax on density. Basically, the disease heavily penalized the richest, most bustling, and most interconnected cities. If you happen to live in a wealthy, culturally significant trading hub, well, you were sitting at the absolute epicenter of the danger.
Let's dive right into the numbers here, because this tax on density was brutal. Venice, which was literally the richest city in Europe at the time, saw a devastating 60% of its population just vanish. Florence, the banking capital of the world, lost 50%. Paris, the political heart, also lost half. The cultural capitals were completely decimated. But here is the really fascinating pattern interrupt. Poorer, deeply isolated areas that were entirely off the grid were largely spared. For the first time in human history, being poor and disconnected was actually a highly effective survival strategy.
Moving on to Chapter 2, the staggering human toll.
Between 1345 and 1353, Europe's population was quite literally cut in half, dropping from 80 million down to 40 million. And over in Asia, the population plummeted from 250 million down to 200 million. The Middle East lost another 30 million on top of that. This single biological event eradicated anywhere between 30% to 60% of the entire global population. Now, what's really interesting about this scale is when you anchor it to something familiar. 200 million people dead globally. To put that into perspective for us today, the immense tragedy of World War II killed roughly 3% of the global population. The Black Death was up to 20 times more lethal globally than World War II. It's just an unfathomable level of loss. But here's the crazy part. The death rates were wildly chaotic depending on where you lived. Your address was literally your lottery ticket. In Florence, at its absolute peak, the mortality rate hit 80%. England saw about 45%. But look at Milan down there at just 15%. How did they manage that? Through sheer brutal force. The authorities in Milan actually bricked the sick inside their homes, literally walling them in to keep the casualties low. And then we see Poland sitting at just 10% mortality, which is a massive mystery we're going to unravel very shortly.
And the terror didn't just strike once and, neatly disappear into the history books. No, it relentlessly returned. There was a second wave in 1361, a third in 1374, a fourth in 1400, right up to the Great Plague of London in 1665. It mercilessly ravaged populations over a grueling 400-year span.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the power of survivors. And this brilliantly illustrates the turning point. See, before 1348, Europe had way too many people and not nearly enough land. The lords held absolutely all the power, and peasants were dirt cheap. But after the plague wiped out half the workforce, the math completely flipped. Suddenly, there was excess land everywhere and a massive shortage of people to work it. Labor became incredibly expensive. For the first time in 1,000 years, the everyday peasant held real leverage.
This sudden demographic shockwave absolutely shattered the feudal system that had been completely entrenched in Europe since the days of Charlemagne. I mean, English peasant wages doubled in just 10 years. Over in France, peasants finally realized their worth and started demanding and actually securing written legal contracts. Down in Italy, urban workers formed powerful bargaining guilds, essentially forcing the government to negotiate with them. The Old World Order didn't end because of some grand, bloody political revolution. It ended because of basic supply and demand.
And the shockwaves completely upended gender dynamics too. Before the plague, female property ownership was hovering around a mere 5%. But with so many men gone, women were inheriting lands and businesses left and right. By 1400, female property ownership shot up to a massive 35%. You had widows running vast estates and acting totally independently in court. The plague accidentally but powerfully empowered women in a way no one saw coming.
All right, Chapter 4, The Country That Got Richer. So I want you to really think about this for a second. With the entire European continent practically burning, trade routes literally carrying death, and massive empires collapsing, which country actually managed to get richer during the Black Death? If you were paying close attention earlier, you might have a guess. Yep, it was Poland. So, why Poland? Well, it really came down to a perfect storm of isolation and hygiene. First off, Poland's geography kept it entirely off those deadly main trade routes we talked about. Second, Poland was home to large Jewish communities who lived in somewhat isolated, self-contained quarters, and, crucially, these communities adhered to vastly superior hygiene practices. We're talking ritual hand-washing, incredibly strict burial customs, and actual quarantine rules. Now, while it's a deeply tragic footnote that anti-Semitism actually rose elsewhere as terrified people sought a scapegoat, economically, these healthy, surviving communities in Poland became the very engine of national recovery.
So the crucial point is right here. Poland's GDP, relative to the European average, just steadily climbs. In 1345, they were sitting at 60% of the average. By 1360, they hit 80%. And by 1400, they are at an astounding 95%. While the rest of the continent's economies were completely imploding, Poland was steadily catching up and capitalizing on their high survival rates.
Chapter 5. Creating the Modern World.
Let's trace how this builds, because this chain reaction is just incredible. It all starts in 1350 with those severe labor shortages. Because human labor was suddenly so incredibly expensive, people were forced to invent machines to do the work. Enter the printing press in 1440. And because the established church couldn't explain or stop the plague, people began deeply questioning ultimate authority, which ultimately sparked the Protestant Reformation in 1517. And because the old medical theories completely failed, thinkers began to actually experiment, igniting the scientific revolution by 1543. The collapse of the old order literally forced innovation.
Which brings us to a really powerful thought. The plague was the worst thing that ever happened to Europe and the best thing that ever happened to Europe. Look, without this devastating, horrific event breaking the suffocating grip of feudalism, historians argue that Europe could have easily remained a static, impoverished backwater for another 500 years. The Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, modern medicine, all of it was catalyzed by a bacteria.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating, if maybe a little unsettling question to ponder. We just lived through the disruption of COVID-19, which took 7 million lives globally. Now, that is a tragic toll, but it's still only a fraction of the Black Death's impact. But the pattern of pandemics is always the same, right? Immense disruption, followed by forced adaptation and transformation. So based on everything we've uncovered in this explainer, if a pathogen as deadly as the Black Death hit our hyper-connected, modern world today, which country do you think would adapt and survive the best? Look at the data, look at the geography, and ask yourself, who would be the Poland of the 21st century?